It's Saturday morning. That means those two great guys full of information you don't want to miss. A veteran show for all veterans. Welcome Major Andrew White, retired, and Marine helicopter pilot Chuck Wright.
Hey.
Hoorah! And welcome back. Man, we have had a great couple days. This is probably one of my favorite times of the year. Summertime, America's birthday. It's just good, to be an American right now.
It is, for the most part, very, very good to be an American.
Exactly.
Forget the idiots, cancel culture.
We're
trying not to go too political, but
that's a whole nother thing. I'm just talking about 4th of July, summertime. America is waking up from its year-and-a-half long siesta, if that's what we want to call it. I don't know the exact word to use, but nevertheless, we're back, baby.
Somebody's jacking with the order of our
exactly.
flags.
Well,
the Army comes first.
Exactly. Then the Marines, your beloved Marine Corps.
Yep. We've told that story on the air. We'll
once or twice.
Again in the future.
I'm sure we will. So we're over here. We're recapping a little bit. We had a great show last week. It was a lot of fun. 4th of July is always a great time around here.
Yes.
Where we are, we just happen to be in one of the best states, I think, hands down, to celebrate America.
And I have to tell you, you asked me when we were off the air about watching fireworks.
Yep.
But we got to watch a show, and it was the Mormon Tabernacle Choir.
Okay.
Singing with the Army Symphony.
Okay.
At West Point. And
Very
tell
cool.
you what, that was so stinking cool. And to watch the fireworks going off over the Hudson River as the night sky turned dark, oh man, that was impressive.
I bet you that would be awesome.
So we're gonna have to crank up the RV, and we're gonna have to make a trip to go see the Black Knights play at West Point. We're already gonna go see them play at Globe Life Park.
Yes, we were. I believe that's early November. If I
believe that is correct.
I want to say November 7th, I think I saw on the advertisement. We'll double check the calendar to confirm.
Couldn't be the 7th.
One of
the 13th is our Marine Corps Ball.
Okay. Well, then,
so a week earlier from that would be the 6th.
Okay. I knew it was around there. It was early November.
We'll talk about that more as we.
And on the 7th, don't we celebrate something November 7th? What day is November 7th? I know December 7th.
December 7th.
November 7th.
November 7th.
I'll look that up. I thought there was a
November 11th.
You're going to have to look that up.
I'll look it up.
Yeah.
We're going to require JP, our producer, when he jumps in, to know what he's talking about.
November 7th.
Andrew White is the only one on the show who is allowed to jump in, completely screw something up, and then have everybody fix it.
There we go.
There we go.
And
I like the fact that instead of you sneezing,
yep.
I always never understood why the Army wants to go, hoo-ha. Hoo-ha, it's Gesundheit. But you started with a robust,
exactly,
with a crisp, hoorah.
Hoorah.
That's how you start the show.
Well,
sorry about that.
That's all right. Well, we do definitely got to start.
Tangent, but to get back on the tangent,
yep.
We're talking about the 4th of July,
yep.
and we have some presidential trivia.
We do. We got
warheads
some
for foreheads.
Knowledge warheads on
knowledge warheads
on foreheads.
On foreheads.
Well,
so break it down.
I'm going to break it down for us. In our country's history, we've had 3 U.S. presidents pass away on the 4th of July.
2 of them on the same
day,
in the same year.
Within
obviously
hours.
If they're both passed away on the 4th of July. It's the same day.
Within hours of each other. And the second one did not realize that the first one had already passed.
Right.
And that would be Thomas Jefferson, who passed away first, and John Adams, who passed away a couple hours later. And John Adams' dying words were, at least they still have Jefferson, unbeknownst to him that Jefferson had passed hours before.
The backstory to this is that Jefferson and Adams had a very contentious relationship.
Political relationship, not personal.
No, actually, they were nasty to each other personally for a while.
But they also became later very close.
Later, they became, as they got later in life, became very close. But also keep in mind the two represented the two distinct At the time that the Constitution, or really not the Constitution, Declaration was written, we were operating under the Articles of the Confederation. But at that point in time, there were two distinct economies in the United States.
Yes.
The northern economy was nowhere near as industrial as it is today, but it was based on trading. Whaling was huge at that point in time. It did not have the agrarian lands that the South had. The South was strongly based on an agricultural economy.
Yep.
And these two men represented not just the political differences,
but the cultural and
differences.
the society differences between Boston versus Virginia at the time. Very, very, and
but we see that happening today and still being played out to this day.
Yep.
Is that Adams favored a strong federal government. Jefferson was a strong proponent for individual and state rights. States' rights. However you say that.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so
November 7th is
Battle of Belmont, 1861. Ulysses S. Grant, huge victory over the Confederates, got them running. That's what I was.
the Battle of what?
Battle of Belmont.
November 7th.
Never heard of it.
That's all right. You know, JP dropping
okay.
more
Dropping
knowledge
some-
bombs for us. More knowledge. That is a knowledge
Warheads
warhead on foreheads.
Yes, indeed.
Watch, you get a ding, ding, ding for something.
There we go.
Oh, yeah,
I
was
like it.
Okay, the Battle of Belmont. I know, did two horses went at it in the stalls?
I'm guessing
I think of Belmont.
Maryland. You know,
Yeah, it would have had to have been in Maryland.
Missouri.
Belmont, Missouri.
Now, that's interesting, as I have actually toured the Battle of Wilson Creek site
Right.
in Missouri. But I didn't know about the Battle of Belmont. So the next time I go to Missouri, I'll try to look that up.
Yeah, they overrun the Confederates, and then the Confederate reinforcements come back. Grant wasn't ready and pushed them back in 1861, which evidently spurred.
Interesting. Very, very early in the war. So we're going to
one of the few victories, but we will get to that in our show.
we will get to that. We're going to jump forward
But we
in
got
a
another-
minute. But we have actually two more presidents to talk
Exactly. The other one, and like I said, we talked about the two, was James Monroe. Also passed away on the 4th of July a few years
about.
later.
The last of the founding fathers.
Yep.
And I mentioned
And-
this piece
I
of
was gonna,
trivia.
I was gonna give you the, but you're
Little
already
piece of
taking
trivia.
it.
He was the last president elected without an opponent. And the reason for that was something that he was directly responsible for. Absolutely a fascinating man. I think he is the most underrated of our presidents.
Without question, I would say he's easily forgotten. But
No.
if people only knew what he had, contributed,
Absolutely incredible.
Yes,
He was Jefferson was very much his mentor, but he was not a man of wealth like Jefferson or Washington or some of the
well,
other
Washington
founding
was not a man of wealth. His wife was.
Okay. Well, you know what?
He married well.
Yeah. Yeah, so did John Kerry. So did a lot of people.
Yeah.
But what the story most people don't know, because Jefferson gets credit for the Louisiana Purchase, the reality is he had nothing to do with it.
Yep, it was Monroe.
So he had given orders to his ambassador to France, and the job was to buy the port of New Orleans. And the ambassador was screwing it up. So very much Monroe was one of Jefferson's trusted advisors, and he said, James, head to France, get this straightened out. So Monroe presents himself to Napoleon, and in conversations, Napoleon says, well, I'll give you all of Louisiana for, and I think it was like another $2 million. It wasn't, in today's dollars, it wasn't much, but at the time, the U.S. didn't have a lot in the currency. Monroe accepted it and he didn't really have the authority to do it, but he signed anyway. By the time he got back with the treaty signed, the Louisiana Purchase Treaty signed, Napoleon was trying to get out of it, and Jefferson was going, that's a pretty good deal. I don't see how we can pass. Now, we fast forward, and it is after the American Revolution. Obviously, Jefferson is president. But it is our expansion into the lands of the Louisiana Purchase, particularly the Ohio River Valley.
Right.
And the wealth that was created in that led to a time we refer to as the era of good feelings. And Monroe was riding a wave that, unbeknownst to him, he'd actually set up years before. And he gets lost. I mean, we remember the Monroe Doctrine. We tend to think about James Madison more. We tend to think about Thomas Jefferson more. We tend obviously, George Washington is the GOAT.
Yeah.
He's just the greatest president of all time. He's easily number one on every list. But Monroe truly deserves a top 5, at least a top 10 spot. And historians overlook all of his significant contributions.
100%. No disagreement there.
But also he died on the 4th of July. Now, we've named 3.
But there's a fourth one.
Who is that fourth president with ties to the 4th
of July? The only president to be born on the 4th of July is President Calvin Coolidge.
Very interesting.
Not such a great president.
He did not do so well in the history books.
No.
And to kind of go back, Monroe is certainly not slighted. He is ranked top 15, top 20, certainly top half. But he really deserved better accolades. Calvin Coolidge may never outlive his accolades.
Yeah, he gave us Mount Rushmore.
It's true.
So you got to give him some kudos.
Got to give him some kudos for that.
Yep.
More than a couple of other presidents that have given us, but we won't go there. So we're really talking about the 4th of July, but we wanted to talk about an absolute turning point in our country.
Yep.
And we're going to break these 2 battles up into 2 different battles, but then we're going to use kind of our last segment to talk about the significance.
The impact.
The impact. And if we can throw up our map, because we're going to give away some of the impact early on. And it was, as mentioned, the Battle of Belmont involved Grant. Grant was not always commander-in-chief, or not the commander-in-chief, the general of all the armies.
In fact, he did not become the general of all the armies till after the Battle of Vicksburg.
That's true. That is true.
He was widely considered a failure and a drunk. And one of
rightfully so.
And one of Lincoln's famous quotes was, "Find out what he's drinking and serve it up to the rest of my generals." Because the only thing Grant was ever good at, or had long success in his entire life, was being a soldier. He was a good soldier. He knew the battle.
What kind of soldier was he?
He was a quartermaster. He was not an infantryman compared to his. In fact, he was an outstanding equestrian. And where he was always upset at is that they never gave him a cavalry command.
Interesting.
And they made him a quartermaster instead. So he understood supply and logistics, which really led to the ultimate siege of Vicksburg. Was he knew by cutting off the supply lines. Yep. And he basically, for almost about a month straight, starved and put a stranglehold on Vicksburg.
Now, let's talk about why this is significant. And we've got the map up. Vicksburg is a city in Mississippi, towards the northern end of Mississippi, that sits right on the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River, we talked about before, and the other tie to James Monroe, is that the South desperately needed avenues to ship goods to continue and pay for the war effort. One of the first things that the Union did was blockade the major ports, and that led to the Confederates building ships known as blockade runners that were actually fairly effective, and that would also lead the South to build ironclads.
Yes, and what were the 2 ironclads?
The Monitor and the Merrimack.
The North called it the Merrimack. What did the South call it?
Oh, I should know this.
Oh, we're going to drop some warhead knowledge over here.
All right. Give it to me.
The CSS Virginia.
Oh, you're right. And I'm gonna come back to that because we're going to talk about another ironclad that fought in the Battle of Vicksburg, and it actually has a significant place. And I'll go ahead and open with this. So we're gonna start with a little bit of a tangent, a little bit of the Battle of Vicksburg trivia.
Right.
The USS Cincinnati had been sunk.
Right.
The North had raised it up, refitted it. They sent it downriver to fight in the Battle of Vicksburg, and the South sunk it again. The only ship in naval history to be sunk twice, in U.S. naval history to be sunk twice. So it was quite the claim to fame. But the key to Vicksburg was this was the northern defense of the Mississippi River. And so what this did, and if you look at the map, you can see that by protecting Vicksburg, it protected the farmers from Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas on the west, and Mississippi and Alabama, and to a degree Georgia on the east, depending on how far over you went. It gave them access to get their goods to market, to get down to New Orleans, to be loaded on a blockade runner. And as I said, the blockade runners had a lot of success because they were fast and the Union ships were slow. And the ocean's a real big place.
Yes, it is.
It's a real big place. So the key to this, and at the time, title was the General of Tennessee. We have divisions and air wings and all of that now, but at the time they just named their generals after the state where they basically, but for all practical purposes, Grant was the General of the West. And he did, in fact, and there was a lot of controversy because the head of the Southern troops was a general by the name of Pemberton.
Yep. Yeah, very great. I'm glad you bring that, because a lot of people think Lee was the commanding general of the Confederate. He only wanted to command the Army of the Virginia.
Army of the Virginias, indeed.
Yep.
And he was on the other coast, and we'll talk about that in the next segment. But the significance of the two battles is they finish by the 4th of July.
Yep.
And even though it's 1863, even though it's 1863 and the Civil War would last for 2 more years, the biggest significance, and I'm stealing part of the thunder, these two battles would, for all intents and purposes, end the Civil War. Interestingly enough, both Jefferson Davis, president in the South, and Lincoln, president in the North, considered Vicksburg the key to victory. And in many ways, it
was. If you look at it,
that a little later.
Absolutely, where it was on the geographic situation, it pretty much could have, it changed the tide of the war for all rights and purposes. Yeah. And Gettysburg was kind of sort of the,
we think of it as the,
not the final nail, but it was definitely a decisive blow.
There's absolutely no question between the two of them. Well, between the two of them, the South would never win another major battle.
That was it.
Yeah. Pretty much done at that point in time. But Grant did. Talk a little bit about Grant's strategy, because it was really very good.
Like I said, Grant always wanted to command a cavalry regiment or a cavalry unit because he was such an accomplished equestrian. He never understood why he was never given the opportunity to lead the men in that way. But, in the Army and all of his infamy wisdom, probably had a lot to do with the hierarchy of the Union forces. If you look at the breakdown of the generals out there, the South, for all rights and purposes, had the more militaristic-minded generals in the sense that understood combat.
Yep.
Perhaps, you can look at Stonewall Jackson, certainly Robert E. Lee, his understanding of the battlefield. Probably there was not a greater military mind at the time
without question.
And
it's
Robert Lee.
Amazing that you see people who will attempt to downplay Lee's expertise, and it strikes me, it's like, do you really know nothing about
you could almost
leadership?
say that Lee's mind, even in today's understanding of the battlefield, would rival
the trilogy,
Yeah.
Lee's Lieutenants, is still on virtually every officer reading list
Exactly.
of every service.
He was a brilliant military strategist, plain and simple.
And he and Grant, and we're kind of talking about Lee, and we're really more for the second segment, but Lee and Grant had both fought together
Yep.
in the Mexican-American War.
In fact, they were both on the same boat together. They were one cannon shot away from both of them never seen the Civil War.
Wow.
When they were laying in Mexico, they were both on the same boat, same barge, same class at West Point.
Yep.
So back to Vicksburg. Like we said, Grant was a quartermaster. And for those who don't know what a quartermaster is, supply and logistics. That is what Grant was as an officer. And he understood that while the Union always had superior numbers for the most part in most battles, but numbers facing in a hometown, the fight was in the Confederate backyard, it all kind of evens out. Grant knew that if he were to set up cannons on either side of the river and shut down the ability for the South to get resupply, he starved out Vicksburg.
Well, what's interesting is you didn't mention one thing.
What's that?
Grant also knocked out the main railroad line.
I was
going to that.
Was going to go there with all supply and logistics, because one of the things, and this will go later on to another general who he was a cavalry commander, is William Tecumseh Sherman.
We're not going to talk about Sherman.
We're not in Georgia. We can talk about him. That's the only place you can't mention Sherman, as though
he's still not very popular down there.
No, I'll tell a funny joke later off. I'm sure we may lose our Southern listening group if they hear that joke that I have that a friend of mine told me once about Sherman, but we'll go into that later. Anyways, I'm back to Grant. Grant had that scorched earth policy, and he just kept them down, and to the point where by the time for a month straight, by the 4th of July, Vicksburg was
the siege of Vicksburg.
They were decimated.
In April.
They could not recover. No matter what they did, Lee just put that anaconda, just tight that grip around them.
Interesting analogy. We're going to come back to that. We'll come back to our main map in the third segment of this, but absolutely perfect analogy. But one kind of personal note, I was going to say, Michelle, we need to put Vicksburg on the day trip list. Bounce over there and do the tour.
That's not too far of a drive from here.
It's like 5 hours or something. It's
JP
just on
road
the
trip.
other side of a.
JP's giving thumbs up. Easy road trip.
Oh yeah, I've been to Vicksburg twice.
Okay, and you didn't take us.
I know. I should have. I should have called you both.
Just that kind of guy.
Well, you know what it was. I was there when the Confederate flags were still up on the grave sites and where things happened, right?
Yep.
And then I went after they took them down. And what a solemn moment for me I just was so disappointed, because that represents our history. You can't eradicate it.
I am, in fact, a son of the Confederacy.
But Vicksburg's is a must. You got to go. It's phenomenal. And they got a great restaurant right down the road in one of the oldest houses in Vicksburg.
Oh, very cool.
Strawberry
good food
cake.
and
strawberry cake. Okay, you've got to text me that restaurant.
I absolutely will.
Michelle and I will make that part of our day trip.
Strawberry cake, family style serving. You get to choose your meats. Oh man, the fried chicken was amazing. And all homemade.
Okay,
sounds like
the show has completely jumped the shark, and we're off.
But you know what? Another good reason to go to Vicksburg.
Channels.
Exactly.
But we're talking about Vicksburg, so
we are talking about Vicksburg.
So it's all right.
We are close to Vicksburg.
I'm going to get out of your way.
No, that's all good.
So, have you got the map back up?
Yep.
So you can see, and I don't know if you can really tell if you know your geography, but you see Louisiana and the port of New Orleans. If you go up from there, just south of where the yellow starts, that's about where Vicksburg is, and it sits. We don't have a map that shows really well, but it sits on a bluff over the Mississippi River. So when Grant headed from the west, Grant landed his troops, moved around, came in from the east, and and I'm forgetting the Commodore's name, who had sailed the Union ships up, and they did manage to sink, as I said before, the USS Cincinnati. But the Union had effectively already blockaded the river itself. And actually, I say that. They had sailed down the Mississippi River.
And here's the thing. With New Orleans, it was also one of the first times that a flat-bottom boat was used as an artillery platform
That's right.
during the Battle of Vicksburg. Look at that, the more
There's a
knowledge warheads on foreheads right there.
Absolutely. So, I have no idea where I was going to go with that, other than this became a crucial battle. And the other thing that it did is it effectively not only cut off Southern Confederate supplies, but it also cut off the states of Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. Although, oddly enough, the last battle of the Civil War was, in fact, fought in Texas.
Did I know where?
Down along the coast.
Okay.
The Confederates had not gotten word that the war was over. The Union tried to land. The Confederates shot at them, so they did what any military guy would do. They shot back. And I believe the South actually won or drove off because the Union guys realized, hey, the war's over. Why are we shooting at people? Let's just back off a little bit. And
let them get the word.
Because, there's just no, my old CO had a great expression. You do not have to practice bleeding. You will learn that real fast when the time comes.
Exactly.
So they said, we're not going to practice bleeding, and the Texans eventually laid down their arms. But we're off on another small tangent. There were several small battle sites in Texas, in Oklahoma, a few in Arkansas.
Pea Ridge.
Pea Ridge, there we go.
I've been to that battlefield.
I have not. So might have to do a southern tour. But I have been to the battlefield at Wilson Creek.
Right.
It is very well preserved. It is very interesting to drive through. We hit it, actually wound up being a completely impromptu day. We were on our way back from the museum at the original. Well, I say museum. That's not really a fair statement. But the original Bass Pro Shop is absolutely incredible on the inside.
Really?
Incredible freshwater aquariums, great things to see. And unfortunately, at the time, they were still building the NRA gun museum, which is now open, and I've heard it's just fabulous. So, and again, we're off on a tangent, but we're talking about what had happened. But that really did cut off. In fact, it wound up cutting off a lot of Mississippi from the war.
It put a big stranglehold on the South. I mean, there's no question about it. That was a near unrecoverable.
Well, and as we mentioned a minute ago, both President Lincoln and President Davis considered Vicksburg the key to the war.
And it was.
In a lot of ways, it was huge. But I want to go to the other part of, because you mentioned Anaconda, and that is a perfect analogy for what wound up happening. And we were talking about Lee. Let's talk about General Lee, but I want to set the stage for this first. And again, it's 4th of July, or it's close to. It's the
July
end
1st.
of June, 1st of July. But I want to go back before that to the late fall, early winter of 1962. And it will have...
1862.
What did I say,
19?
Oh, my gosh, a little Freudian slip there. Sorry about that. So I'm going to go back, and Michelle and I have toured this battle site, and it was extremely interesting. And it will have a lot to do, as you talk more about Gettysburg. But it's the Battle of Fredericksburg, but more specifically, the Battle of Marye's Heights, which was one section of Fredericksburg. And envision this, if you will, and I believe we've talked about Mary's Heights in the show before, but it is a long but relatively steep, not like a cliff going up, but a good 20-degree grade going up, a very difficult grade to climb. And at the top of this is a stone wall, a good 2-3 feet thick. Even with the 55 caliber bullets of the day, it wasn't going through that wall.
No.
The Confederates were well ensconced behind this wall, and the Union, for some silly reason, because you can, even to this day, there's still enough open space, even though some of the buildings were there, but most of them were not. You can still see and go, why are you fighting up this hill? And the South put a huge licking on the Union troops. And again, in a small tangent to this, there is a bronze statue, and it is to the Angel of Mary Heights. And who this was is there reached a lull in the battle.
Right.
And for the most part, it was all Union troops laying out in the open, wounded. People don't realize they did not die instantly of a gunshot wound. Sadly, most of them bled out.
Or died of infections, disease. I mean, back then, obviously, surgical kits really consisted of a
hacksaw.
A tree branch to bite down on, and a hacksaw.
So what had happened is this Union soldier grabbed up canteens, jumped over the wall, and began administering what little first aid he could, but largely taking water to these men laying out in the open, laying out in the sun, in absolute agony. And he was going from soldier to soldier, and at first Union sharpshooters were trying to hit him until it dawned on them, because I think they thought he was going out and killing these people, which actually might have been rather merciful, but they stopped firing because they realized that he was trying to help them at a point in time when they were basically helpless. And so they've built a statue to him there. And this is part of a tactical story, and he's more a sidebar, but there is this beautiful bronze there of him. There we go. We, in fact, have the picture of the bronze up. And I've been there. It is very touching we were talking about ghosts. That's one of the myths.
And we'll talk about that in Gettysburg.
But you can feel that, and it was a place of hallowed ground. Now, after the battle, and it was a bad Union thrashing, although it wasn't.
But most Union thrashings up to this point were horrible. I mean, the Union did not have a leader until they had Grant.
Until they had Grant. Not really until they had Meade.
Yep.
Yeah, Meade would replace Hooker, and we'll talk about that in a second. But and still leading into this, we get into so basically winter is coming, and basically the Union tucked tail. They had a bad beating, and they went to lick their wounds, and the South didn't do anything. It was winter. Nobody moved in the winter. It was not. They weren't going to try Valley Forge again. They weren't going to try to catch the Huns sleeping after a good drunk on Christmas Eve. Basically just went to their respective corners and prepared for the spring. So spring rolls around. And before we get to Gettysburg, there are two major battles. Antietam, which is for all practical purposes a draw. Nobody really won. Nobody really lost. They took heavy losses. But the Battle of Chancellorsville was a tremendous Confederate victory. And there are those who will speculate, before we get into the Battle of Gettysburg, as I'm trying to set this stage, that will speculate that Lee got a little bit cocky, like a football team started reading his press clippings, and basically became a little bit overconfident, which you had mentioned a general. And he was, interestingly enough, not a classically trained military officer, but rather a college professor by training.
Yep.
And he was killed accidentally when a sentry did not get his challenge or got scared or for whatever reason shot at a rider coming towards him and sadly killed probably Lee's best general.
No.
Or one of his best.
His absolute best general. And
Stonewall Jackson.
Stonewall Jackson, and it was said many times when Lee found out about the shooting of Jackson. Jackson, again, another example of someone who did not die right away.
Right.
It took 3 days before Jackson would succumb to his wounds.
Yeah.
He was shot in the left arm, and Lee, when he rode to his side and told Jackson, "You may have lost your left arm, but I have lost my right."
Yep.
And referred to Jackson as that was his most confident, and Jackson, like you said, he was a professor at where? VMI, Virginia Military Institute.
I pulled that one out.
Yep.
So, and if you want to read it, yes, I do own an autographed copy of it.
Shocking revolution going on right here. Chuck owns another autographed copy of a book.
His book is called Rebel Yell, and it is excellent. It is written by S.G. Gwynn, who is also known, probably most famously, for Empire of the Summer Moon, which is largely written from the perspective of the Comanches, but truly dives deep and tells a great story, no holds barred, the truth on both sides of how brutal the Comanches were, how brutal they were treated. There were some Indian tribes I have no sympathy for, and the Comanches were one of them because they were absolutely horrific.
Yep.
They made Hitler look like a Boy Scout.
Yeah,
They were bad. But having said that, Rebel Yell is a great book about Stonewall Jackson if you have an interest in driving deep into that. In fact, Stonewall Jackson was responsible for the South's first major victory as well. But
Battle of Bull Run / Manassas.
Yes, indeed.
Yep. And there he is.
There we go.
You know,
there it is.
Stonewall Jackson. And
Stonewall Jackson.
he was as fierce of a commanding general as they came.
And amazingly, because he didn't teach, he taught at VMI, but he taught history.
Yep.
He did not teach military instruction, but certainly picked up more than a little bit of it while he was
exactly. And he was unbelievably respected on both sides.
So we have the Battle of Gettysburg, and it breaks down, and we'll talk about it in 3 phases.
Yep.
Day 1 is Round Top.
Right. Well, day 1 and 2 were Round Top.
True.
You know,
And day 3 really
is Pickett's charge.
It's really summed up by Pickett's charge.
Exactly.
It wasn't the only battle of the day.
But that's the most famous and recognized of all the
the battles.
Yep.
But the interesting thing,
and there we got it on the map.
We were talking about, and Gettysburg takes place.
Gettysburg was kind of an accident also,
Yes.
because it was a crossroads. They knew Lee was on the march.
Yep.
And the Union forces knew that, hey, we cannot let them get to D.C. or Philadelphia or get any closer. So they kind of just sort of ended up in, Gettysburg.
And the way the geography works, kind of all roads led to Gettysburg.
Exactly.
And we'll go off on another tangent.
And so
name the president who retired to Gettysburg.
I don't know.
Oh.
Well, I know Eisenhower had his ranch.
Yeah.
Oh, all right.
Yeah, Eisenhower retired to Gettysburg.
I knew he had a ranch out there, which he took Army One. Remember we talked about helicopter,
right? On the very
he
first
flew
flight.
Army
Very
One.
first flight. Anyway, we're off on another one of our tangents. But talk a little bit about the Battle of Round Top, and then I'm going to talk about one of the myths of the Battle of Round Top.
We had, at the Battle of Round Top, one of the heroes, if you will, or most legendary individuals of Gettysburg, a man by the name of Colonel Joseph Chamberlain, Medal of Honor recipient.
Not to be confused with Neville Chamberlain.
Not to be confused with Neville Chamberlain. Although there may be family history, who knows?
Who knows?
You know,
now,
Colonel
one
Chamberlain
of them was a coward, and the other one was anything but a coward.
Yes. Colonel Chamberlain, commander of the 20th Maine Infantry Brigade. Their job was to hold the spot. It was a little hill, which was also the Devil's Den, as it later got known. Of the battle or the site as Little Round Top. And Chamberlain and his men set up. And like you said, most of the generals on both sides of the war knew each other very well. They were all classmates.
Right. Oh, yeah.
They all got
go to
taught
West
the
Point.
same.
They all served together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They all got trained the same military tactics.
And most of them got bloodied in the Mexican-American War.
Exactly. Yeah. So there wasn't a whole lot of surprise on what each would do.
Right.
So they knew each other. Well, Lee had his men attack. He knew that Meade would either be strong on the right and the left flank, but probably weak in the middle, or very strong in the middle and weak in the left flanks. Well, he sent his Confederates up on the sides, thinking that Round Top would be the easier of the approaches to take Meade. Did not know that while Stonewall Jackson was the tough hombre of the
of the South,
every bit of toughness in Jackson was also in Chamberlain. Chamberlain would not give up that hill. And he fought tooth and nail, pushing back the Confederate, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And on the final charge on the first day, was one of the few last major fixed bayonet charges.
Wow. That's scary to think about when you're dealing with a rifle that's generally about 4.5, 5 feet long.
Yep.
Significantly longer than the weapons we have today. And the bayonets were 12 to 15
Oh, yeah,
inches
those are some
themselves. Long. They were pikes.
And that's where, the rebel yell and all is because the Union, the 20th Maine charged down and pushed them off that hilltop, never surrendering the hilltop for 2 straight days, which led to Lee's decision to send, ultimately, Pickett through the middle. Unbeknownst to him, that Meade had pulled the 20th Maine off of Little Round Top and put them.
Now, Pickett's charge was actually on day 3.
Exactly. So on the 3rd day, Chamberlain and his men were relieved and sent to the middle where Pickett's charge came up that hill.
Now, we talked at length about the Battle of Marye's Heights.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we brought that up is because the situation was almost perfectly reversed. Lee should have known better than attacking across open ground.
At a pretty significant incline.
At a pretty significant incline against troops that were well dug in and a highly defensible position. It was not a good idea.
No.
Of course, another one of Lee's tactical mistakes, another one of his outstanding generals was Jeb Stuart. And Jeb Stuart was a cavalry officer, and he gave Jeb Stuart the authority to kind of range on his own, and he did not have them available because he was trying to flank the Unions.
And we talked about it in a recent show. Why were they delayed?
I have no idea.
There was a lieutenant that was supposed to be court-martialed that day that took all the men that he had available to his ability and rode around in circles and kicked up dirt and dust, giving the impression that they were a much bigger force. A lieutenant at the time by the name of George Armstrong Custard.
So one of the things that had happened, and it was one of the biggest tactical mistakes that Lee made, was ordering Pickett's charge. And over the course of the Battle of Gettysburg, it was the single worst day for casualties on either side.
And in American history, we lost more men that day than in any other battle.
So, of course, that you double it because you're fighting yourself.
Yep.
So the stat is a little bit misleading, but it was horrific.
Any way you slice it, it was a bad day.
But as we talk about the significance, and almost unbeknownst to each other, the two what would be most significant battles of the Civil War wrapped up on the 4th of July, or near the 4th of July, in 1863. Mm-hmm. Even though the war would go on for another 2 years. And one wonders if Lee lost sight of his vision. Had Lee won the day, basically what happens, now Washington, D.C. in and of itself was fairly well defended. So it's doubtful he could have marched on D.C., but he certainly could have marched on Baltimore. He potentially could have marched on Philadelphia.
And he could have pulled what Grant did to Vicksburg
in reverse. Very much so, and that was the plan. Lee's intent was to sue for peace. He had invaded the North, and he intended to win the day, threaten those cities, which Baltimore and Philadelphia were virtually undefended, and the Union could not afford either of those cities to fall. He would have cut D.C.'s supply lines completely off, so he's effectively laying siege to D.C., even if he doesn't fire a shot. They basically have no way to get food in and out. Although they could have potentially done it up the Potomac River, but quite frankly, that would not have been hard to blockade. But his idea was to gain acceptance and even potentially recognition from European countries, effectively ending the war. Sadly, the war would go on for another 3 years, largely because he repeated the same mistakes the Unions made at Mary's Heights, the Battle of Fredericksburg. Perhaps it was losing Stonewall Jackson, but you wound up cutting off. Now, a lot of people say when you cut the Mississippi, you cut the South in half. It was really more 1/3, 2/3. The significance is you cut off their lifeline to get goods and services to Europe to fund the war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like I said, both battles resulted in tremendous loss in life.
Yep.
Tremendous significance in history of how the battle and how it would shape the war, American history, the ultimate outcome of the battles. It would be the last time the South would
win a major battle.
Yeah, they never recovered from.
And effectively, Chancellorsville was the last battle.
Yeah, it was the last.
You're right. The South would never recover. So one thing, and I wanted to read the exact line.
What's that?
But in the Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln had a line, and this winds up being one of the most quoted, oft quoted, one of the most famous, shortest presidential speeches. But he had a line, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here." The one line in the Gettysburg Address that could not be more wrong.
Yep.
Most school kids have recited it. When we were at the Lincoln Monument, I made Travis go over and read it aloud, hoping that some of it would stick. But in November, later that year, Abraham Lincoln would go to, I want to say inaugurate, but that's not the right word. But basically, he would go to say words at the opening of the Gettysburg Cemetery, which houses thousands of our fallen on both sides.
Over 5,000 combined.
Yep. But one of the great myths is that he wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope. Actually, not true. He wrote it on his own presidential stationery, because the original draft, now he did make notes on other pieces of paper, and one of them might have been an envelope, but the original draft is with the Library of Congress in his presidential
I
library.
mean, not in your library?
Not in my library, unfortunately. Can you imagine
we need to,
what that's worth?
Oh,
Probably more than my entire library combined.
yeah, that's a significantly important document.
Now, another great myth of the
What's
Battle
that?
of Gettysburg. The battle was fought over shoes. The Confederates were running out of supplies.
Okay.
They were desperate for shoes. Many of the Confederate soldiers fought barefoot. True story. But that is a myth. There was no shoe store anywhere near Gettysburg. The battle was fought there because that's where the roads converged.
Exactly.
Largely because of the geography. It's a beautiful country. And if you've not been to do a tour, I recommend it highly. It's one of the things I want to do. We'd hope to have my brother on, who's quite the expert on these subjects, quite the Civil War buff. But he wasn't able to join us tonight. But he used to be an instructor at Quantico. Quantico is basically the Marine Corps University.
How far is that from Gettysburg?
Hour and a half. Maybe
that's not too bad.
Yeah, no, it's close. You go, you take the Beltway out west, and then travel north, and that's how we travel. We actually went through, went near the town of Gettysburg. I don't think we went through it. We left my brother's house to go to the Cape, and the other regret that I had, especially after seeing, I actually saw two documentaries this week. One of them is about there's an island where there's a Scottish castle. It's actually a reconstruction of a Scottish castle, but it was actually an armory. There was a guy in New York who had kind of cornered the market for military surplus, and the city of New York said, "We really don't want you storing all that black powder here." So he bought an island in the Hudson River and built he was Scottish. And then, sadly, the reason the New York didn't want it there is it actually blew up. But on our way back, I had thought about, hey, let's detour and let's go up to West Point, because it really wasn't that far. We were tired.
No,
we were ready to get back to Virginia. But definitely a place that we have to go, not just Gettysburg, but I'd love to go up the Hudson to look at some of the American Revolution sites. But to get back on topic, we're talking about the 4th of July in 1863. And, JP, will you throw the map back up? Because now the Anaconda story makes – no, not that one. The map of Vicksburg. The first map of Vicksburg. Actually, it's a map of pretty much the entire South. Right. But you said Anaconda before, and that becomes a perfect example, because after Vicksburg and after Gettysburg, the South was in. The North had the South in a chokehold.
Yep.
Yeah. Grant would be made the commander
of the Union forces.
All of the Union forces, because he had done so well. And so as you're looking at the map, Gettysburg is to the north end of the yellow. On the East Coast, Vicksburg winds up they cut off the Mississippi River, so everything west of the Mississippi becomes irrelevant. They are unable to provide reinforcements. They are unable to provide supplies. And sadly, it's a bloody 2 years. And it's almost interesting to go back and look at it in history. As brilliant as Lee was, why at that point he didn't say, hey, we've lost.
You know what? And there's two good movies that depict a lot about what you're talking about. The first one is Gettysburg, which talks a lot about Chamberlain. If you have not seen it, great. It is a long movie. It's a 3-hour plus movie. But the other one, Gods and Generals.
I was assuming you were going to say that.
Yeah. Both movies are absolutely phenomenal. And they really, talk about, both these events and how the impact of them, the leadership. And while you're right, Lee probably did read maybe some of the newspaper clippings, and that but it was also Lee had trouble looking his soldiers in the eye and telling him, it's over, my brothers.
Yeah.
That was a difficult thing, and there's a pivotal scene where all the soldiers, after Pickett's charge and everything, the Confederates were saying, General, we're with you. We'll fight again. We'll charge up the hill again. And he's riding on his trusty steed named...
I forget.
Traveler.
Traveler, that's right.
He had 5 horses, but his favorite horse that he would ride was Traveler.
Which also happens to be the name of USC's white horse they ride as their mascot. Well, they're right with their mascot. The mascot's a Trojan, and I don't mean a condom. Making fun of all my USC friends.
Right.
I don't have any USC friends
anymore.
I found they to be very, very arrogant people.
Yep.
So, sorry about that,
but that's
USC
right.
fans.
But
Just ask me about scoreboard, baby.
I think it was very much a little bit of ego, a little bit of he could not bring himself to let these men that were willing to die for him, literally die for him. But that now brings us up to a few of the fact and fiction things. Now, I personally have never attended Gettysburg College, the college or university now?
College. I'm going to assume it's college still.
Whatever it is, college or university. It is widely speculated and believed by anyone who attends there that the ghosts of the Union and Confederate still roam Gettysburg. In fact, and one of the dorms is supposedly built on the ground where the original morgue for,
Now, and I'm going to segue here, and I'm going to pick on my wife because she follows every one of these old home sites going.
Yep.
And she says, here's this great one in North Carolina. And during the Civil War, it was a hospital. And I'm looking at her like she's got 2 heads because I'm like, if there's ever a place that is going to be just inundated with poltergeists, it's going to be a Civil War hospital. Yeah. I don't even want to go see it. I don't want to drive by it. I don't want to be anywhere near it.
Well, Gettysburg, supposedly, and I've heard this story many times.
Gettysburg College, by the way.
Gettysburg College
talking about.
And again, back to this dorm that's built on supposedly ground of where one of the morgues were, and I'm sure there's probably several morgues that were set up in the day given the amount of casualties. They say from time to time when the elevator comes up and you get in there are ghosts of service members just hanging around the elevator trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And you hear the story constantly.
B1 for me. I need to get back to the morgue.
And I'm just thinking like, I kind of want to go, but at the same time, I don't really want to go.
Now, I have stayed in the Hotel del Coronado, and I recommend that highly. Right. That hotel is said to be haunted. Uh-oh.
And
here
Crockett,
we're getting music.
The hotel,
Driscoll.
the one down San Antonio?
No, that's the Menger.
The Menger.
That's the Menger Hotel. That's the hotel where Teddy Roosevelt recruited Rough Riders in the bar. And yes, I have had a beer there.
They have great French toast.
Do they?
Yes, they do. Good breakfast there. Well, it's so JP's
getting the music.
And that is our cue to wrap her up. So I hope you enjoyed today's show on learning a little warhead knowledge on foreheads over there. But it was fun. Make sure you stay in, tune us, like us on Facebook, follow us out there, and we will catch you next week. For Chuck and I, hoorah and hoorah. See you all next week. Bye now.